The chamber was supposed to be ordinary that day, routine proceedings, measured tones, the usual grayness of Washington politics. Yet in an instant, all of that predictability shattered. Cameras snapped to attention, reporters leaned forward, and the room fell into an unexpected hush. From the bench, Judge Gustavo Gelpí, a man known more for his reserve than for dramatic pronouncements, uttered words that reverberated far beyond the walls of that courtroom. He looked directly toward Representative Jasmine Crockett, her presence steady, her eyes unwavering. And with the gravity of someone who had seen countless leaders rise and fall, he declared her a rising star. The phrase itself seemed to hang in the air, heavy with meaning. It wasn't just a polite nod or ceremonial compliment. It was as if time slowed and history leaned closer to listen. Those two words carried an authority that demanded attention, slicing through cynicism like a spotlight cutting the dark. Viewers across the country replayed the moment instantly. Headlines began to flash. Judge Gelpí calls Crockett a rising star. Clips raced across social media timelines, captions exploding with pride and disbelief. For her supporters, it was vindication. For skeptics, it was a shock. And for those who had doubted her place in the national conversation, it was a reckoning. Because Jasmine Crockett wasn't supposed to get this kind of validation, not from someone with Gelpí's stature. She had been the target of sneers, interruptions, dismissals meant to keep her small. Yet here she was, her composure intact, her dignity unshaken, receiving a recognition that couldn't be spun away or ignored. The nation could feel it. Something bigger was happening. This wasn't about a single comment. It was about the story behind it, the years of grit, the nights of doubt, the battles where she had been underestimated again and again. Gelpí's words didn't just describe Crockett. They declared a shift in the air. Nobody expected what came next. Nobody expected this moment to ignite a conversation that would ripple across politics, media, and culture alike. Because this wasn't just a compliment. It was a turning point. Why did those two words matter so much? Why did Judge Gelpí's remark echo far beyond the walls where it was spoken? To understand that, you have to understand the battlefield Jasmine Crockett was walking into. Washington is not built for voices like hers. It's a stage long dominated by men in tailored suits, wielding decades of insider connections, where dismissiveness isn't an accident, it's a strategy. Freshman representatives are often treated like background noise, especially women of color who dare to bring sharp questions and sharper truths. The arena is designed to grind down newcomers, to force them into silence, or worse, into conformity. And yet Crockett refused to shrink. She refused to trade authenticity for comfort. Every time she raised her voice in a hearing, every time she demanded clarity when others tried to blur the truth, she carved out space where she was told none existed. But carving out space in Washington comes at a price. Sneers from senior colleagues, interruptions meant to remind her of her place, commentators on television dismissing her as too fiery or too inexperienced. Critics didn't just question her ideas, they questioned her very presence. That's why Gelpí's declaration mattered. In a city where validation is currency, his words gave her something her detractors couldn't dismiss, credibility stamped by authority. When he called her a rising star, it wasn't a fleeting compliment. It was a direct challenge to the narrative that had sought to keep her small. For her supporters, it was fuel. Immigrant families who had seen their children brushed aside heard in Gelpí's words a recognition that the overlooked could no longer be ignored. Women across the country, tired of being spoken over in boardrooms and classrooms, felt a surge of pride. Even those who had doubted her before now found themselves rewatching the clip, asking, had we underestimated her all along? The stakes weren't just about Jasmine Crockett's career. They were about the broader fight. Could dignity and determination still triumph in Washington's cutthroat world? Could someone rise not by bending to power but by holding their ground? Gelpí's words became a test case, a symbolic verdict. And the timing couldn't have been sharper. Politics in America was polarized to the breaking point, with every headline dripping in conflict and division. In that climate, voices like Crockett's weren't just resisted, they were targeted. To label her a rising star was to acknowledge that truth could still pierce through the noise, that persistence could still win respect, even when the system tried to deny it. For her critics, it was a nightmare scenario. Validation from a federal judge gave her legitimacy they couldn't easily spin away. The dismissive laughter stopped. The interruptions suddenly carried more risk. Every attempt to paint her as unworthy now looked more desperate. And so the stage was set. What might have been a passing moment became something else entirely, a pivot point. Because what followed Gelpí's words would change Crockett's career trajectory forever. It would ripple outward, beyond the walls of Congress, beyond the endless cable news debates, and into the living rooms of Americans searching for a reminder that their voices, too, could matter. This wasn't about a single comment anymore. This was about a fight for space, respect, and truth in a system built to deny it. And as the country leaned closer to watch, the clash between dignity and arrogance was about to erupt in ways nobody could have predicted. To grasp the true weight of Jasmine Crockett's rise, you have to confront the forces that tried to stop it. Every hero's journey is defined not only by what they achieve, but by the resistance they face, and Crockett's resistance was nothing short of relentless. From the moment she stepped into the national spotlight, the guardians of the old order sharpened their knives. Senior colleagues whispered behind closed doors, questioning whether she was ready for prime time. On cable news, polished pundits smirked, calling her a firebrand without substance. The dismissals weren't subtle, they were calculated. Their goal was clear: define her before she could define herself. One commentator sneered, "She's more interested in sound bites than solutions." Another chuckled on air, "Give her a few years, she'll learn to play the game." Even rivals within the chamber sought to box her in. When she pressed too hard in hearings, they rolled their eyes, cut her off mid-sentence, and muttered about her tone. It was the classic playbook: diminish, patronize, erase. But beneath the arrogance lay something deeper: fear. Fear that her unvarnished authenticity might resonate more deeply than their scripted talking points. Fear that her willingness to call out hypocrisy could expose their own. Fear that, in a country hungry for voices that sounded real, she might actually connect. And in Washington, connection is power. The establishment has always had a way of protecting itself. Its members cloak themselves in the language of civility while wielding backroom deals like daggers. They pride themselves on experience, even as that experience often means decades of compromise and complacency. Crockett's presence unsettled that balance. She wasn't there to play along. She wasn't there to wait her turn, and that terrified them. For every sharp exchange she delivered in a committee hearing, the backlash was immediate. Headlines scolded her for being too aggressive. Critics accused her of chasing attention. The subtext was clear: know your place. But Crockett's refusal to bow only made their discomfort louder. Contrast that with her own approach: direct, rooted, unapologetic. While they hid behind procedure, she spoke in plain language. While they offered rehearsed lines, she drew from lived experience. She didn't pretend that the game of politics was noble theater. She called it what it was: a struggle for justice in a system that too often failed the people it claimed to serve. This contrast, authenticity versus elitism, became the heart of the conflict. The establishment needed to preserve the illusion that only insiders held wisdom, that only those with pedigree could lead. Crockett's very existence threatened that illusion. Every time she commanded attention without their permission, she weakened their grip. Their hypocrisy was glaring. These were the same voices that preached about democracy while silencing those who embodied it. The same figures who praised fresh energy so long as it never questioned their authority. They claimed to value diversity, but only if it came in a polite, contained package. Crockett refused to be contained. She refused to trade her sharp edges for acceptance. And so the attacks escalated. Subtle dismissals turned into open derision. Political opponents branded her as divisive, as though demanding respect was somehow more polarizing than denying it. Media segments highlighted her style over her substance, desperate to distract from the uncomfortable truths she unearthed. The more she rose, the harder they tried to pull her back down. But here's the truth about arrogance. It blinds those who wield it. In their efforts to belittle her, Crockett's critics exposed their own fragility. Every eye roll, every interruption, every condescending remark became a mirror reflecting their fear of losing control. They mistook her resilience for recklessness, her passion for weakness. They failed to see what her supporters knew instinctively, that the very traits they mocked were the traits that made her unstoppable. And history has a way of humbling the arrogant. Every empire, no matter how fortified, carries cracks within its walls. And in the shadows of their dismissive laughter, in the echoes of their hollow critiques, Jasmine Crockett was quietly positioning herself. The establishment's arrogance wasn't a wall, it was a weakness that she was about to expose. Because every empire has cracks, and Crockett was about to find her moment. Before the cameras, before the hearings, before the headlines, Jasmine Crockett was just a young woman standing at the edge of two worlds, one shaped by hardship, the other by relentless hope. Her story was never destined to be easy. It was destined to be earned. Born into a working-class family, she carried the weight of expectation and the reality of limitation. While others inherited shortcuts, Crockett inherited the long road. She grew up in communities where dreams were often deferred, where every opportunity was something you had to wrestle out of the world's reluctant hands. She saw neighbors fighting to make rent, children walking paths lined more with struggle than promise. That reality carved into her a truth. If justice was going to come, someone would have to fight for it. Education became her weapon. Where others doubted her, she doubled down. Late nights spent over books, endless hours studying while balancing jobs that barely paid the bills. These weren't just steps toward a degree. They were acts of defiance against a system that quietly expected her to fail. Law school wasn't just an ambition, it was a battlefield. And on that battlefield, she discovered her calling. As a young attorney, Crockett didn't chase corporate paychecks or elite law firms. She went where the fight was rawest, defending those who couldn't afford their own defense, standing beside clients society had already discarded. In cramped courtrooms with no cameras rolling, she learned the unglamorous side of justice, the side where victories were rare and losses weighed heavy. But she also learned the power of presence. To show up for someone, to argue for them when the world had already walked away, that was justice too. Her career became a pattern of choosing the harder road. Cases that no one wanted, clients who had no one else, communities overlooked by politicians except during election season. Crockett didn't just practice law, she practiced loyalty to people who had been abandoned. And in return, those people gave her something priceless: trust. Trust became her foundation when she moved into public life. She didn't step into politics with the polish of an insider. She stepped in with the scars of someone who had been in the trenches. The same blunt honesty that made judges sigh in courtrooms became the same honesty that electrified audiences at rallies. She wasn't reciting talking points, she was telling the truth she had lived. Of course, honesty is a dangerous currency in politics. It made her a target from the start. But Crockett had already learned how to withstand the storm. She had already been doubted, dismissed, and underestimated. She had already learned how to fight with dignity intact. Every time a rival tried to cut her down, she remembered late nights with no money for food, remembered standing in court for clients the world had written off, remembered her community watching her as proof that their voices mattered. Her journey was cinematic not because it was smooth, but because it was scarred. Every setback became a forge, every dismissal another hammer striking steel. She was, in every sense, a fighter forged in fire. And people felt it. Immigrant families saw in her the echo of their own struggles, arrivals into a system that told them no until they carved out a yes. Women saw in her resilience the fight they had waged in silence for generations. Young people saw someone refusing to bend, proof that you didn't have to erase yourself to rise. Crockett's rise was not an accident. It was a slow, grinding climb that tested her will at every turn. She stood up to arrogance not because she was untouched by struggle, but because she was defined by it. And when she entered Washington, carrying the cadence of her community rather than the jargon of the elite, she brought with her the undeniable weight of lived experience. That's why Judge Gelpí's words carried such force. He wasn't just complimenting a politician. He was recognizing a life of scars and survival. He was nomming what her supporters already knew. Jasmine Crockett wasn't built by privilege. She was built by persistence. And it was those very scars, those long nights, those battles fought and fought again, that would prepare her for what came next. A moment of national validation that would shake even her fiercest critics into silence. Washington thrives on theater, and Jasmine Crockett found herself thrust onto its stage again and again. But unlike many of her colleagues, she didn't play for applause lines or hollow victories. She played for truth. And truth, when spoken by someone unwilling to be silenced, has a way of cutting through the noise. One of the first flashpoints came during a tense committee hearing. A senior member, seasoned in condescension, interrupted her mid-question. He chuckled dismissively, as though her words were a distraction rather than a demand for accountability. Crockett paused, not flustered, not rattled. Instead, she looked him dead in the eye and finished her question with even sharper precision, her voice unwavering. The moment went viral. Viewers weren't just impressed by her command of the facts. They were struck by her calm refusal to surrender dignity, even when the odds were stacked against her. It happened again weeks later. Another colleague, visibly irritated by her persistence, tried to paint her as uninformed. Crockett countered by citing chapter and verse of the very statutes he had misrepresented. The room fell quiet, and the arrogance on her opponent's face collapsed under the weight of her clarity. The clip raced across social media with captions like, "She just schooled him on his own law." Respect wasn't given to Crockett. She earned it piece by piece, moment by moment. But it wasn't easy. Every victory was followed by fresh hostility. Commentators accused her of being combative. Rivals whispered about her attitude. Yet the more they tried to frame her as unfit, the more the public saw the opposite. They saw a woman navigating a hostile chamber with a blend of sharp intellect and unshakable composure. They saw someone who could take the very weapons of dismissal, interruption, arrogance, condescension, and turn them into proof of her strength. What her critics failed to understand was that Crockett wasn't playing their game. She wasn't chasing points for the evening news cycle. She was building something larger, a reputation for fearlessness. For every smirk thrown her way, there was a moment when she turned that smirk into silence. For every attempt to corner her, there was a counterpunch so precise it left her opponents blinking in disbelief. And in those exchanges, millions of Americans watching at home felt a surge of validation. How many times had they been talked over in meetings? How many times had their knowledge been dismissed, their persistence framed as defiance? Crockett's resilience wasn't just her own, it was theirs, embodied on the national stage. The pattern became unmistakable. Each flashpoint revealed the same dynamic, arrogance against authenticity, dismissal against dignity. And each time, Crockett proved that calm, focused truth could outlast noise. Respect wasn't given freely in Washington, but Crockett was prying it from the establishment's clenched fists. Yet even as her reputation grew, the establishment still clung to its old arrogance. They mocked, they doubted, they dismissed. They couldn't admit what was becoming obvious. She was already rising. Until one day, in a single televised exchange, a judge would put into words what millions were already feeling. The room was never meant to carry history that day. It was the kind of setting most Americans would scroll past on C-SPAN, a hearing with muted tones, thick binders, and the slow grind of institutional process. But history doesn't ask for permission. It arrives when it's ready. And on this day, under the cool lights and clicking pens, it arrived in the voice of Judge Gustavo Gelpí. The exchange had been tense but measured, the kind of back-and-forth where opponents expected to wear down the younger representative with interruptions and over-explanations. Crockett, as always, held her ground. Her questions were crisp, her tone deliberate, her posture unmoved. Those watching could feel the familiar tension. Would the establishment once again dismiss her, roll their eyes, and pretend she wasn't ready for this stage? And then, without warning, the air shifted. Judge Gelpí leaned forward. His words cut through the room, sudden and deliberate. Congresswoman Crockett is a rising star. For a heartbeat, silence. It was the kind of silence you could hear. The kind that falls when people realize they've just witnessed a moment that will replay for years. Reporters' pens froze. Staffers glanced at each other, eyes wide. The cameras, already rolling, captured the unmistakable reaction. Crockett's calm face, not flinching, not breaking into spectacle, but holding steady with a quiet dignity. The phrase itself, rising star, wasn't complex. But in that chamber, from that judge, it landed like thunder. This was no casual remark at a cocktail party. This was validation spoken in the arena of power, where validation is currency and credibility is often withheld from those who need it most. The critics felt it instantly. The ones who had laughed at her inexperience, who had sneered about her tone, suddenly found themselves scrambling. Their arsenal, dismissal, arrogance, belittlement, had been disarmed with 3 words, because what defense could they muster when authority itself had declared her worthy? On television screens across the country, the clip replayed. News anchors paused, then leaned into the words, "a rising star." Commentators debated what it meant, but the meaning was already obvious. This wasn't spin. This wasn't theater. This was a stamp of legitimacy, hammered into place before a national audience. And then came the wave. Social media erupted. Within minutes, hashtags lit up timelines. Rising star. Memes flooded in, pairing Gelpí's quote with images of Crockett standing tall in hearings, eyes unshaken as critics tried to diminish her. Supporters who had cheered her battles online now had a rallying cry. Immigrant families shared the clip with their children, writing captions like, "See, they can't ignore us forever." Women in boardrooms and classrooms clipped the moment into their stories, saying, "This is what it looks like when you don't back down." The contrast was cinematic. On one side, her critics looked rattled, trying to downplay the remark. Some dismissed it as polite. Others tried to pretend it hadn't happened at all. But their silence was telling. The arrogance that had once fueled their interruptions now looked like insecurity. The smirks they once wore so easily now seemed hollow. The very forces that had tried to diminish her suddenly seemed smaller, their power shrinking under the weight of Gelpí's words. On the other side, Crockett herself stood as the embodiment of composure. She didn't gloat. She didn't grandstand. She didn't need to. Her calm, steady presence said it all. She had been here all along, doing the work, fighting the fights, refusing to be silenced. Gelpí had simply spoken what millions were already feeling. That was the brilliance of the moment. It wasn't just about a judge recognizing her. It was about the American public seeing their instincts confirmed. Every time she had been interrupted, every time she had been dismissed, supporters had felt outrage on her behalf. Now, that outrage transformed into vindication. It was as if the country collectively exhaled. Finally, someone said it out loud. Commentators scrambled to adjust. Some who had once mocked her suddenly softened their tone. Overnight, her name carried a new weight in panel discussions. When her clips appeared on news programs, they weren't framed as outbursts. They were framed as leadership. And in politics, perception becomes reality. The ripple effect stretched far beyond Washington. College students replayed the clip in dorm rooms, using it as proof that the system could still make space for truth. Grassroots organizers adopted Gelpí's words in speeches, framing Crockett as a symbol of persistence against arrogance. Even rivals, though grudgingly, acknowledged the shift. One pundit admitted, "She's clearly earned her place in the conversation." But perhaps the most powerful reaction was personal. Everyday Americans, the ones who had been told you don't belong or you're not ready, saw in her a reflection of themselves. Crockett wasn't just a rising star in Washington. She was proof that rising stars could come from anywhere. Her critics had tried to write her story for her. Too new, too loud, too raw. Gelpí's words ripped that narrative apart. In its place stood a different story, one written not by the establishment but by her persistence, her scars, her refusal to bend. And while the pundits debated what it meant for the future, Crockett herself didn't need to say much. Her very composure in that moment was its own mic drop. She didn't rise to the bait of arrogance, didn't feed the flames of drama. She simply stood, calm and resolute, embodying the truth that had just been spoken. She was rising, and nothing they did could stop it. It was more than a compliment. It was more than a headline. It was a turning point, one that the establishment could neither ignore nor erase. Because in that room, under the steady gaze of Judge Gustavo Gelpí, dignity had triumphed over dismissal. Authenticity had outshined arrogance. And the critics, so confident in their power, were left in the only place they feared most: silence. But history has a way of moving quickly once the spark is lit. This moment wasn't an ending, it was ignition. And what came next would send shockwaves through politics, media, and culture alike, reshaping how Jasmine Crockett was seen not just by her colleagues, but by the nation watching at home. The silence after Gelpí's words didn't mark closure. It marked the beginning of something larger, something the critics could no longer contain. The echo of Judge Gelpí's words didn't fade when the hearing adjourned. It thundered outward, rolling across newsrooms, television studios, and timelines until it became something far larger than a single compliment. Within hours, what had happened in that quiet chamber was everywhere, spliced into 30-second clips, captioned, memed, and shared with a speed that no campaign ad could ever buy. The first wave came from social media. A simple phrase, rising star, became a rallying cry. Hashtags exploded. Rising star, Crockett 2025. Videos of her exchange with Gelpí hit millions of views before the evening news even aired. TikTok creators layered his words over dramatic music, cutting between her sharpest debates and her most composed silences. On Instagram, stylized graphics of Crockett with the words "Rising Star" in bold letters filled story feeds. On X, ordinary users wrote things like, "This is the first time in months I felt hope watching politics." Then came the amplification. Celebrities chimed in, actors, musicians, and athletes who rarely comment on politics shared the clip with one-line endorsements. One pop icon wrote, "Leaders like Jasmine Crockett remind us why we fight for change." A legendary basketball player tweeted, "She's got that fire. Respect." Suddenly, Crockett's name wasn't just circulating in political spaces, it was entering pop culture. Mainstream pundits scrambled to catch up. Morning shows played the clip on repeat, their anchors leaning into the moment with wide-eyed emphasis. Cable panels debated whether this was the start of something bigger. Was Crockett destined for higher office? Could this be a national breakout? The tone was unmistakable. She had crossed a threshold. No longer was she simply Congresswoman Crockett from Texas. Now she was the rising star of a new generation. And then, almost as quickly, the critics began their dance. The very commentators who once dismissed her as too green or too combative tried to spin their way out. Some insisted Gelpí was being merely courteous, downplaying the impact. Others claimed it was premature to call her a rising star. But their efforts rang hollow. Audiences had already chosen their interpretation. The clip wasn't just Gelpí's words, it was the validation of everything they had seen Crockett embody. The hypocrisy was glaring. The same pundits who once smirked at her now tried to hedge. "Well, we always knew she had potential." Rivals who had underestimated her began crafting careful soundbites, framing her as a voice worth engaging. It was too little, too late. The people had seen the moment unfiltered, and they weren't letting anyone rewrite its meaning. The ripple effects reached the political class, too. Members of Congress who had once spoken over her now paused before interrupting. Colleagues who had brushed her off began quoting her in interviews. Invitations to panels, conferences, and policy roundtables multiplied overnight. Behind closed doors, strategists noted the shift. Crockett was no longer optional to include in the conversation. She was central. Perhaps the most profound shockwave wasn't political at all, it was personal. For countless Americans watching at home, Crockett's validation felt like their own. Women who had been dismissed in boardrooms, students talked over in classrooms, workers ignored in meetings, they saw their struggles mirrored in hers. Gelpí's words carried beyond Crockett. They became a declaration that persistence could break through, that authenticity could be recognized, that voices long underestimated could no longer be silenced. Community leaders replayed the clip at gatherings. Activists quoted it in speeches. Teachers showed it to their students as proof that representation mattered. Even in small towns and distant states, people felt the ripple. The message was simple. The establishment's walls weren't impenetrable after all. It was a cultural ignition. Crockett didn't just rise, she carried others with her. The memes, the hashtags, the commentary, they weren't just about her. They were about what she symbolized. The idea that the overlooked could become undeniable. The idea that America still had space for leaders who fought with both fire and integrity. And yet, even amid the celebration, the narrative wasn't finished. Because the story wasn't just Crockett's rise, it was what that rise represented for the nation. The critics were scrambling, the supporters were mobilizing, and the establishment was recalibrating. But beneath all the noise, one truth was emerging, clear and unstoppable. Crockett's validation wasn't about politics alone. It was about every American who had ever wondered if they could matter in a system designed to shut them out. And that was the real shockwave. But the real story wasn't just Crockett's rise. It was the message her rise carried for every American watching. When the noise of headlines quieted and the frenzy of social media faded into the background, what lingered was not just a clip or a compliment. It was a lesson, a story bigger than Jasmine Crockett herself, because what Judge Gelpí had done in calling her a rising star was more than an acknowledgement. It was a reminder that justice will always outlast arrogance, that persistence will always outshine elitism, and that dignity will always triumph over cynicism. Crockett's journey had been a long road through dismissals, interruptions, and outright disrespect. And yet, she never lowered herself to match the arrogance of her detractors. She didn't trade her authenticity for access. She didn't let their sneers bend her spine. Instead, she leaned on what had carried her from her earliest battles, her grit, her grounding in community, her refusal to abandon fairness no matter how many times the powerful tried to talk over her. In that sense, her rise was not just political, it was deeply human. It was the story of every person who has walked into a room and felt underestimated, every voice silenced in meetings, every dream mocked as too ambitious. Her dignity in the face of dismissal became a mirror for millions who had faced the same trials in their own lives. And isn't that what America is supposed to be about? Not the coronation of the already powerful, but the elevation of the persistent. Not the gatekeeping of the elite, but the courage of the overlooked. The lesson of Crockett's moment is that true Americanness is not about entitlement. It is about endurance. It is about standing your ground when others push you aside. It is about rising above the noise, not because the path is easy, but because the cause is just. That is why her story resonated. It told us something we desperately needed to hear, that the cynicism drowning our politics does not have to be the final word. That arrogance will always crumble when faced with truth spoken calmly, firmly, and without apology. That no matter how polished the gatekeepers, no matter how entrenched the insiders, they cannot withstand the slow, steady force of persistence. Crockett's validation became a parable. If she can rise above dismissal and doubt, then so can we. If she can walk into the halls of power and remain grounded in her purpose, then so can we carry our convictions into the places where we are underestimated. Her fight is not just hers. It belongs to anyone who has ever been told to sit down, to stay quiet, to wait their turn. And in the end, isn't that the heartbeat of this country? A belief that no matter where you start, no matter how many times you're silenced, you still have a right to stand up, to speak out, to be heard. That dignity is not a gift the powerful can grant. It is a truth we all carry within us. The Crockett moment reminded us that fairness still matters, that courage still matters, that Americanness itself, at its best, is about lifting each other higher, not tearing each other down. It is about saying with our actions and with our lives that arrogance does not get the final word. And as the clip replayed across screens and the words "rising star" echoed across living rooms, it wasn't just Crockett who rose. It was the belief that justice can still break through, that persistence can still move mountains, that dignity, even in its quietest form, can silence 1,000 jeers. Her story tells us the fight is worth it, and if she can endure, so can we. But even in this moment of reflection, one truth remained. Crockett's journey was not just about inspiration. It was also a call to action. Judge Gustavo Gelpí's words didn't just describe a rising star, they ignited a movement. What began as a single sentence in a single moment has grown into something far larger. A story of justice outlasting arrogance, of persistence defeating elitism, of dignity shining brighter than cynicism ever could. Because in that instant, when Jasmine Crockett was named a rising star, America was reminded that hope still has a place in our politics, that the voices once silenced can no longer be ignored, that when truth stands tall, even the loudest dismissals fall into silence. This isn't just about one leader, it's about all of us. Every time we share stories like this, every time we lift up voices of dignity over voices of arrogance, we prove that this country still belongs to the people willing to fight for fairness. And that matters, because the more we amplify these moments, the harder it becomes for cynicism to take root. So let this be more than a headline. Let it be a call. Share this story. Subscribe so you don't miss the battles and breakthroughs still to come. And carry this truth with you. Respect and justice are not relics of the past. They are alive, burning, and rising with every voice that refuses to be silenced. Jasmine Crockett's journey shows us what is possible, and if she can rise, so can we. Together, we can prove that no amount of arrogance can dim the light of dignity. This is more than politics. This is Americanness at its best, and it is only the beginning.